Okay, so metadata is data that describes data. So it's data that comes attached to the data to label it. It's all about the data. Yes, it's a description of the data. It allows the understanding and interpretation of data, and it is as important as data. And we will make this point in the next slide. So it should be continuously added to your research data, continuously meaning your data should always come with metadata, and it should be always updated, and it can be produced in an automatic way or manually. So just to make the point about what I was introducing in the previous slide, if this is a confocal microscopy image of C. elegans nematode, which was deposited in public Comero server. And the main question here is most of a reflection time. So just by looking at the image, what information can you guess without the associated description and metadata? Obviously, the answer here is quite clear and is not so much, right? If science was made only by data itself with no label on that, there's no science at all. So we're gonna look today at real examples of metadata and in public Comero repository. Just a brief introduction about it. So public Comero includes projects and datasets, and I can probably actually copy paste these links in a sec, or maybe someone else from the helpers group can do it. Julia, okay, thanks to the share notes. Thank you. So you can have a look at it yourself. So this is to introduce the concept that a project usually includes multiple data that can be organized in the format of a data set. And these are two examples of well annotated data and metadata, because every image is associated with different types of metadata, like the date, the dimension, but even very technical details as pixel types and so on. And the tags, the creator, the DOI, if any, again, at date, timestamps, and so on. So each image in the dataset includes metadata, but we also have dataset associated metadata. So a description, the biological materials that we used with, the main aim of the dataset and the project, and again, DOIs when relevant. So just to make the point that there are different levels from our metadata, and every item inside our scientific project usually has or should have some metadata attached to it. Because of this, there are different types of the metadata. Metadata can be administrative, so relevant on how to manage the project. For example, the experimental code, the grant code, the PI name that is coordinating the project, and so on. Metadata can be descriptive or allow citation. So they assist with the discovery and identity of the single, for example, the image. In this case, the author's IDs, the persistent identifiers, so DOIs that are linked to the, for example, the publication of the image, or structural. So metadata can be structural when they describe how did we come up with this data. So for example, in an image, which type of instrument we use to get it, all the data about the equipment, the collection method, and even the folder structures in the project. This is also structural. So anything that helps us in navigating where to find it and how we originated it. And this is how we jump to the first exercise. So I'm gonna copy paste it inside our pad here. It's already there. Someone did it. Okay, exercise 1, identify types of metadata. So the pod includes a link that we can also pass it in the chat eventually to this Excel spreadsheet. So we're going to create 3 breakout rooms, and in groups, you're supposed to discuss which types of different metadata are included inside this table. So you're supposed to label the administrative metadata, descriptive or citation metadata, and the structural metadata. Thank you, Julia. And should I create the breakout rooms? Okay.
So the breakout rooms should be created already.
I don't see them. Maybe you should open them.
Yeah, exactly. I can just open.
Okay.
Should I?
Yep. Is it clear, the exercise for everyone? So you should discuss which type of metadata are there, and we're gonna give you 5 minutes.
So Lisana, a question came up in our session about should one declare conflict of interest? Is that part of the metadata?
What's your take on this? I would say, well, typically, for example, the conflict of interest is part of a publication. But yes, since this, it's also, I mean, this applies from the early stage of a project. I would say this might be a meaningful metadata indeed, if not even data. But we will also discuss that there's no clear threshold between data and metadata actually. This is something that we will cover later on. What's your take on this, Victoria?
I think it's always better to declare than to not declare. If you just have that extra reminder to add something about who you work for, and if your organization promotes a certain mission, and this is the data associated with your workplace. So yeah, that's generally how I see it. But I think for most research institutions, you don't have a specific interest or financial interest in publishing your data. So yeah.
Yeah, sure. But I think that asking yourself the question is always a good point. So having the field might be relevant in many cases, even if that's often not the case. You have a conflict of interest in research institution, sure. Any other this piece of discussion that you would like to report from the breakout rooms in general, while we have a look at the
yeah, we were kind of it came up that the study date range might actually be both descriptive and structural, maybe, and similarly the author metadata might be both administrative and descriptive because it might be relevant to administrative tasks as well. So yeah, we kind of got to the point where like maybe we can't categorize every single type of metadata quite properly.
Indeed, that's actually what we were going to say. So this is a proposal of how to classify the different metadata inside this table, but it's just a proposal because I would even argue that some metadata could be data of other studies. For example, the date. If I'm collecting data for a study on the publication themselves or the experimental studies themselves, then the date is definitely a part of my data, right? So there's no clear-cut definition, but the purpose of having a look at this, I would say, is that these 3 categories should be covered in your metadata. So if you, at least something of all of the 3 should be there. If you're not having, adding any structural, so structural metadata is the typical type of metadata that the researcher includes in their data because it's related to the equipment and so on. So this is the one we are mostly used to. But it's very, very important also to link this data to larger efforts, for example, the grants, or to provide details on who's working towards that aim and how to contact them, and so on. So the main point here is that your metadata should always include all three categories. And yeah, this is sort of a repetition of what we just discussed. There's no clear-cut definition between data and metadata. And one would argue that the data that is inside the table is all data. So this is totally relevant. Provided that you describe well your data, whatever you call metadata or not, it's fine. So what to include in metadata? And here we enter the field of minimum information standards. So minimum information standards are a set of guidelines for reporting data and delivered by relevant groups, so relevant experts in the field. They ensure that the data can be easily verified, analyzed, and clearly interpreted by the community. Here again, a link of the minimum information for biological and biomedical investigation standards. So this is basically a website where you will find all the different collections of standards. Thank you for Julia or whoever is actually adding this to the notes for today. Sorry. So this is how the website looks like. It has several different standards, and you can search your specific field or your specific instrument or your specific type of data, and you will find a collection of the standard metadata that should be there. I think the next exercise, indeed, in the next exercise, we will have a look at one specific case of that, but I highly encourage you to have a look at your own field whenever you have time. So, and this is the exercise 2, minimal information example. So you should scroll to the reporting requirements of this minimal information standards and decide which of the point 1 to 8 are important for understanding and reusing data, important for technical replication, or could be applied to other experiments in neuroscience. So for these, I would say that we don't need breakout rooms. We can do it together, or we can do it in the pad and then comment. That's what I would do. So I'll stop sharing for a sec. So when you define metadata, the point and the whole purpose of the exercise is to think about like from the perspective of a consumer of the data and not the producer. Try to think what I would need if I were to use this data, and not how much do I want to describe my experiment. That's a shift in thinking somehow. Sure, very important point. You can be the consumer of your own data, and that's often the case when you stay in a field and want to advance your experiments of some years ago or even some months ago. So yes, think about you from the perspective of a consumer of your data. So to close this little chapter about the metadata, now I would like you to take a moment to think about the data you generate in your projects and imagine that you're going to share them. So what information would another research need to understand and reproduce your data? And yeah, these are some hints of, so in the pad, you will find some hints for the discussion. For example, of course, you will need a name or a title of your project and the experimental purpose and experimental hypothesis. But to stimulate a bit of a discussion, if you could add other things to this list there in the write down your proposal section. Long and clear README file. Okay, we're gonna touch on README files in the next session. Thank you for adding it. Anything else? Anything you maybe are not including that often or so far, and you started thinking about it by reading the standards, reference to protocol CO, right? We're also going to touch on this. I agree. I would argue that this should be included in the README. So the organization of your project, I think it should be included in the README. Or you can have a separate file that describes the structure of the subfolders and so on. But yes, it should be. Also because having this file somehow proves that you thought about the structure of your folder as a whole, right? That you actually thought about it. And this is, it might not be the case. Then we have contact information of collaborators. Yes, very, very important, especially if some collaborators are not, for example, if you are in a GitHub project and some collaborators are not active in GitHub, this might be the case. You should anyway include them or include the contacts to them in case there's any part of the data that they are responsible for. And I think this happened very often, that they are not included. Anything else you would like to add? Okay. If not, then we can transition to the next set of slides.